Why has Donald Trump deployed camouflaged federal agents to the streets of Portland, Oregon? Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. The orders come from the Department of Homeland Security, which insists those forces will stay as long as it takes to quell lawlessness surrounding Black Lives Matter and defund the police protests. That's over the objections of local authorities. The U.S. president even wants them sent to cities like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. The outrage is palpable, particularly after images of a 53-year-old Navy veteran beaten and pepper sprayed went viral. He felt the agents were violating their oath and wanted to know why they were doing it. We'll ask about the outrage on both sides, with Donald Trump claiming that politicians are, quote, from the left are, quote, just fine with 50 days of anarchy. He blames what he calls radical left Democrats who totally control Biden. Yes, how will this deployment of force play with voters in the fall? There's a campaign that's on. How much will the campaign test U.S. democracy as we know it? Today, in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what some have dubbed the militarization if you will, of the protest movements in the United States. Talking about it with us from Boca Raton, Florida, Darren Beattie, former White House speechwriter. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
From New York City, Peter Emerson is a Democratic policy and a political strategist. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Also in New York, I want to welcome back to the show Bernard Harcourt, who teaches at Columbia University, the author of The Counter-Revolution, How Our Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be back, François.
And as any Parisian who's gone native and Bagamary, well, enjoying a vacation and who is in Italy with us from Vasto and Bagamary, Paris correspondent for Law.com International. How are you?
I'm fine, but I'm not not working, as you can plainly see.
It's work from home. Here we go.
Work from home.
I know. I feel your pain. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. Yeah, Tuesday evening, once again, there were minor clashes in Portland between those federal agents. Some of them unidentified, according to journalists and protesters. Not so, says the Department of Homeland Security. Catherine Viette has more.
It's a show of force that has critics crying foul after Donald Trump deployed federal agents to quell unrest in Portland. Trump says the authorities are there to protect federal buildings, but protesters tell a different story.
They were not in uniforms, they were in camouflage, and they were in unmarked cars, and they were grabbing people off the street who were walking away from whatever was going on down here.
The ongoing protest against racism and police brutality in Portland and other cities are a thorn in Trump's side. Trump, who has declared himself the law and order president as he runs for re-election, has vowed to send federal agents to other cities, including Chicago and New York.
All run by the same liberal Democrats. And you know what? If Biden got in, that would be true for the country. The whole country would go to hell. And we're not going to let it go to hell.
Both mayors have threatened to sue the president.
While we all understand that having additional federal resources can be a value add, they're not a value add if they're nameless agents riding around in vans, pulling people off the street, depriving them of their constitutional rights. That is not what a democracy looks like. And we are not going to have that in the city of Chicago.
Oregon's Attorney General has already filed a lawsuit against the federal government for unlawfully detaining protesters in violation of their constitutional rights.
Outcome of those proceedings will really impact what the president is legally going to be allowed to do in other places, but he is certainly testing his limits.
Critics say the deployment of federal forces has only increased tensions with demonstrators and local officials.
Darren Beattie, what's it all about?
Well, I mean, there are many dimensions to that question. I think the immediate and most obvious answer is this is about establishing some semblance of stability and order in these cities that have seen continuous rioting, burning, looting, and violence, and whose municipal and gubernatorial leaders seem to demonstrate no willingness or inclination or ability to put an end to it. And so I think that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is to project a sense of imposing authority. And I wonder how much of it is the spectacle, how much of it is the reality. I think much more could be done if the administration were seriously interested in putting a stop to these, rather than creating an encouraging but ultimately insufficient spectacle.
Peter Emerson?
I'd like to step away from what the specifics are happening in Portland and Chicago, and let's look strategically exactly what's happening in this country. Number one, this is an unlawful president, maybe taking lawful action under the laws that came into effect after 9/11, but ultimately the goal here is the election. This is what it's all about. And whether it is putting federal marshals in unmarked police cars and federal authorities in Portland and Chicago, wherever else, ultimately, we have to look at the fact that this Trump presidency is looking desperately to get reelected, because if he's not reelected, he's going to be indicted on the first day after the election, number one. Number two, this is a man who is willing to do anything, including let thousands of people die by the coronavirus. And third, if we look in October, as we call in America, an October surprise, my suspect will be that he will possibly, and quite, I think, effectively, postpone the election. I think this is what it's all about. So parsing what's happening in Portland has little interest to me, only because ultimately the very democracy, which is demonstrated by our elections, is going to be determined by what Trump does in October.
So part of an electoral calculus. Anne Begamary, let me first ask you, again, is it legal, the sending in of these federal troops without the request of local authorities? In the US, you have a very decentralized system.
Well, based on what our reporters at law.com and our commentators have been reporting, and as is often the case with something regarding the law, it depends. There are federal laws on the books that authorize the sending of federal troops to protect federal buildings, establish order. That's a pretty well covered landscape. And as some of the other members of the panel have pointed out, these actions may indeed be legal. The complicating factor, though, is that there's really no body of law, and there's never been a clear Supreme Court decision on the authority of the president or the government to use the military to enforce domestic law. There are several laws on the books, in fact, that specifically prohibit it. The Posse Comitatus law is probably the most famous one, and that's been mentioned quite a few times. But there are nuances in this. It's allowed to protect federal buildings, although you can argue, and maybe nobody wants to get into the weeds of what's happening in Portland, but sending unmarked police cars, unmarked police officers or military officers to enforce the law simply because there's a federal building nearby probably doesn't fall within the scope of the allowed enforcement. But since there has not been a solid body of law and certainly no clear Supreme Court decision delineating what the president can do, there's plenty of room to maneuver. And I think as it's fair to say that we've seen with this president that if he finds a way to maneuver, he will maneuver. His lawyers will help him find a way to maneuver. And that may indeed be what's going on here.
Yeah, Bernard Harcourt, does the opposition in the United States underestimate Donald Trump?
I don't think anybody's underestimating Donald Trump. I think everyone can see straight through it. I'd say, contra Darren Beattie, that it's not about creating order. It's clearly all about politics. He tried to use the military in June, and he got a big backlash. He had the airborne in Washington, D.C., and so he was using military force at the beginning of June, and there was a huge backlash from the generals. So he can't go that route. So now he's turning to basically kind of his shock troops, his border patrol, the folks who have been most kind of protective and most Trumpian in their approach. And what he's trying to do is foment conflict in this country. Now, because he believes that by fomenting conflict, he can prevail, or at least try and catch up in these elections. It's pretty clear that what he's doing is entirely illegal. Now, whether a court would determine that it's illegal, that's another matter. I mean, courts are political, so it depends which judge you would go in front of. But it's pretty illegal because he is basically trying to create order. He's not simply trying to protect federal courthouses. That, of course, the federal government can do, but that's not his agenda, and that's explicitly not his agenda, and that's not his rhetoric. He's not there simply to protect a federal building. He's there to create order. So in other words, what he's doing is he's policing in a militarized fashion, right. And that he cannot do unless he invokes the Insurrection Act of 1807 or tries some other legal method to intervene. But the arrests, for instance, that have taken place in Portland, when you look at them closely, you analyze them closely, most law professors agree there's no reasonable suspicion or probable cause to arrest many the folks who've been taken off by unmarked agents in unmarked cars. That was completely a violation of the Fourth Amendment. There's no question about that, I don't think.
Darren Beattie, the U.S. president has strong backing from those who thinks the federal government overreaches, that states should police themselves. How does he justify this?
Just really quickly on that earlier point, I do agree that a lot of it is politics and spectacle. And from my and many other supporters' point of view, it's an encouraging sign, but a little bit too late. I think where I might qualify or even correct your previous speaker, I would like to draw attention to the fact that there's a deep ambivalence about this within the White House. And in fact, until quite recently, the prevailing strategy was one of just sit back and let these cities destroy themselves, in the thinking that, you know, the Trump voters and just regular American people would look at it and see what a disaster it was and then automatically vote for Trump. I think that was incorrect, and I think they're starting to realize that their advisors were wrong on that, and that in fact it looks weak and incompetent to allow cities, albeit left-wing Democratic cities, whatever, they're still in the United States, and it reflects poorly on leadership to allow this to happen. And so I think there is an ambivalence there that needs to be pointed out. And the idea isn't simply to sow discord. The discord is already there. The question is, as the leader, as the president of the United States, does it look good to simply allow these things to happen unanswered? And I think—
Well, you agree it would be a gross exaggeration to say Portland is burning. The protests have been consigned to just a few city blocks. And since those federal agents moved in, there have only been 43 people detained.
Well, I think that's a huge problem, and that's part of why I'm suggesting that a lot of this is spectacle for political purposes. I think if there really were a serious and unqualified interest in stopping this carnage, the DOJ would be more actively aligned and be pressing more serious charges against the perpetrators involved. I think the lack of really serious charges being thrown at a lot of these violent participants suggests that maybe, at least at this stage, it's more for the political spectacle to assuage voters who look at this and see, why isn't the president doing anything, than it is a kind of concerted and effective effort to actually establish order in these cities that have succumbed to anarchy and violence and destruction.
All right, anarchy, violence, destruction. You heard Peter Emerson, Darren Beattie mention the word carnage. I go back to what you said at the outset, that this is all about November and that presidential election. Again, Donald Trump's strategy, how does Joe Biden counter it?
He's letting Donald Trump basically try to defeat himself. I'm not in total agreement with that policy. We'll see how that plays out. At the end of the day, the carnage has been in the Black and Hispanic communities with the virus, with the President of the United States, with willful neglect and ignorance. I think, again, to just step a little bit further out in a macro sense, yesterday the Senate brought forth the nomination of a woman who believes in taking the United States back to the gold standard. She's likely to be confirmed, by the full Senate for the Federal Reserve Board. What we're really seeing here is an attempt to take the United States back to a standard of rights, which is white property owners, men, white male property owners. That's the ultimate goal here. And for Mr. Beatty, in looking at recent tweets, I understand exactly what he's saying and what his position is. He points out that the Red Bull CEO, that's the beverage, is getting rid of Black Lives Matter activists, and the company is encouraging. I mean, this is an administration that is actively trying to eliminate immigrants, Blacks, Hispanic, people of color, whether they be men or women, take this country back to white male property owners. That's the carnage.
But again, Peter, my question is that if I follow your premise, and it is a willful strategy of divisiveness, can that strategy work?
Yes, absolutely. What drives me, you asked earlier about whether or not the opposition to Trump is taking Trump seriously. Yes, on one hand, they are. I agree with Bernard. But on the other hand, there is this belief that somehow the laws and the institutions of this country are going to rise up and protect us from what Thomas Jefferson warned us about: tyranny and authoritarianism, as your friend Mr. Capitas pointed out last week, and dictatorship. There is no vehicle for that. Both parties have been guilty over decades of creating executive power that is unmatched. It's historical. And Donald Trump, as was pointed out, has all sorts of means to use that power to keep himself in office and to do terrible and irreparable damage to American society. So consequently, I worry that the opposition to Trump may not see the actual reality of his power and, more importantly, his capacity to exercise that power no matter what.
Not everybody is in disagreement, again, with Donald Trump when it comes to deploying police to places like Chicago. We heard the mayor at the outset in that report saying she was firmly against it in this instance. Bernard Arcot, you used to teach in Chicago. Your reaction to the fact that the head of the biggest policemen's union posted on Facebook that help is on the way, joining with it a letter sent to the US president where he's asking him to send in those federal agents, saying that he hopes this is the beginning of a unique and dynamic alliance that will help save Chicago?
Right. Well, as you know, police unions have been the most reactionary forces in this country over the past, decades, but also during the past months, during the following the murder of George Floyd and all of the protests. It's really the police unions that have been the single most reactionary force trying to retain what is in effect the territory of the police. So that's not surprising, but I don't think it really indicates much about the rank and file, nor does it indicate much about the police management, nor about the administrators at a higher level.
Because even when it comes to Portland, Bernal, there is disagreement over to what degree the mayor and the police chief resisted against the arrival of these Homeland Security ordered federal agents.
Right. Yeah, no, there is there is some debate and there are some controversies over whether or not the local police have in fact been working with some of these federal agents. And some of the mayors the mayor is denying it, although there was clearly some communication going on. But I think from a larger perspective, on the question of political strategy, right, President Trump has taken a complete hands-off position regarding COVID, regarding masks. It's all deference to the states, all deference to the governors, total deference there, right? Now,
except in the past 24 hours, where now he says you should wear the mask.
Yeah, right. Well, okay. I mean, he's seeing the windstorm that's hitting him, I suppose. But I mean, he could. It's clear that, I mean, this is all politics. I mean, he could take exactly the same position regarding the policing and the order enforcement, right? He could take exactly the same back off, deference to the states, deference to local municipalities. That would be totally logical and sensible and consistent politically. He's not doing that in part because he's trying to present himself as the law and order candidate in the tradition that there's a long tradition of this, as you all know, tracing back to Richard Nixon, who used law and order as a way to get elected, and others. So, I mean, what's going on clearly is it's an entirely political move to try and foment conflict, which is what he likes best and what he thinks is strategically most important to him, to create conflict, to create racial tension in this country, and to use the protests as a way to do that. And it's a long continuation in this country of movement toward what I would call the counter-revolution, where the government is increasingly using paramilitary policing forces, right, to achieve its objectives. I mean, this isn't the first time we see these folks who are dressed as if they were in Iraq or Afghanistan on the streets of America, on Main Street America. We saw it in Ferguson at the local level. We saw it at the beginning of June when he called in the troops, and also paramilitary kind of shock troops. I mean, he had paramilitary prison, the federal prison department, basically, folks from there. I mean, he's using this militarized, aggressive policing form as a continuation in a long, decades-long tradition of moving towards a counter-revolutionary, counterinsurgency mode of governing the country.
Darren Beattie, do you agree that, as you just heard Bernard Harcourt say, that sending in federal agents in camouflage is part of a continuum, militarization of US democracy?
In a way, yes, I do agree with that. And in general terms, I too am quite concerned about this worrying trend of militarization of police and law enforcement, particularly going back to 9/11 and so forth. I think particularly in relation to the recent events, however, it's important to introduce additional dimensions of the dynamic. I think that just as these specific troops might be characterized as a kind of paramilitary force, although, as I've stated, I think a really serious effort would be followed up by actual prosecutions, I think it's even more interesting to consider how these Antifa, organized Antifa groups, actually function as a kind of paramilitary in their own right. And I think it's very interesting to look at, given the kind of self-description of these actors as resisting power, how basically the entirety of corporate America, all of the white shoe law firms, basically every powerful institution in this country has one way or another lent rhetorical support to the arguments behind these protests. And so I think it's actually an interesting dimension to think of how these Antifa groups, which are able to act largely with impunity, where the law enforcement will just sit back and let them wreak destruction, are in their own way a paramilitary force of the kind of corporate ruling class in this country. And I think that's
corporate ruling class.
Yeah.
Jesus. How so?
Well, let me repeat myself, that every single major corporation in the country, all of the white shoe law firms, basically every institutional organ of power in the country has expressed rhetorical support for the arguments associated with these violent protests. I think if you look objectively at where the overwhelming weight of institutional power lies, it is with the protesters and not with the American people who are shocked and horrified about these protests. I think it's actually, I don't want to get out of context if you want to focus on the election, but I think it's interesting to compare these violent protests with the extended protests that occurred in France with the yellow vests. And I think they had very different relationships to the establishment. I think.
Well, let me bring in Anne Bagamary on this.
Yeah.
Anne, here in France, you've covered it yourself. We did have violent protests. We did have the government accused of, at times, allowing the violence to unfurl so that public opinion would turn against those yellow vests. And we do have Antifas as well, who and the complaint that the police doesn't do enough to stop them when there are peaceful protesters marching. Is the whole Antifa thing a red herring, or is there a kernel of truth to what Darren Beattie just said?
I keep going back to a wonderful line in a wonderful film called Trading Places back in the 80s, where one of the captains of industry that Darren Beattie seems to think is behind the Antifa movement, or at least as a fellow traveler of the Antifa movement, comments that they're paying some of their employees an awful lot of money. And one of the other characters says, well, you can't get around the minimum wage. There are rules of law. There is a body of jurisprudence that does regulate what governments can do in terms of keeping peaceful protests peaceful. I think that governments what's happening with the protests in the US, and I think you're going to see perhaps today, because a federal court in Portland is going to hear a case where the mayor of Portland is asking not that the federal troops be withdrawn, but is asking simply that they obey the rule of law, that they identify themselves by their affiliation, and that they limit their ability to detain to
just that's an important point, Anne. Can you just explain that for our viewers around the world? Because here in France, you don't see the CRS riot police with name tags. Why is that so important?
It's important because, at least in America, there have been laws passed and there have been court rulings that make it plain that anybody who is engaging in law enforcement needs to be properly identified. In America, it actually goes back to the Constitution. It goes back to the Third Amendment, which talks about not billeting soldiers in private homes without the consent of the homeowner. It's a very clear separation between military and civilian enterprise, military and civilian activity, and keeping the military out of domestic law enforcement. Why is it not enshrined in French law that the CRS has to identify himself? I must admit, I'm not an expert on French constitutional law. I wouldn't even call myself an expert on American constitutional law. But the fact that the military needs to, that law enforcement needs to be clearly identified, except in cases, of course, where they're undercover and it's critical to the mission, that just simply has to do with knowing who you're dealing with. And that's an important part of the foundation of American democracy. So this court hearing in Portland is going to hear about that. I find it very interesting that it's not about saying send them all away. It's about saying make them obey the rules. If they're going to be doing domestic law enforcement, have them do it according to the rule of law.
All right, so there's consensus among the panel that a lot of this is politics. Speaking of politics, and in the context of what we've seen since the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police and the Black Lives Matter protests that we've seen over the past 50 days and more, this is one of the latest ads put out by the Trump campaign for his reelection.
Seattle's pledged to defund its police department by 50%, even including a proposal to remove 911 dispatchers from police control.
Joe Biden said he's absolutely on board with defunding the police. Listen closely.
Yes, absolutely.
Hello, you've reached 911. I'm sorry that there is no one here to answer your emergency call, but leave a message and we'll get back to you as soon as we can.
Crime will rise significantly.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Peter Emerson, how do you think that's going to go down with voters?
It's very powerful. I can't help myself because I've been involved in every presidential campaign since 1976. The most important characteristic of any campaign is emotion, and the most powerful emotion is fear. That's a very powerful ad. It has a lot of antecedents in that it has a lot of pivot points. You've got a white elderly woman. I'm sure that was a Black or Hispanic immigrant who broke in. And of course, it bases itself on a lie because no one is actually expecting all polices to be defunded. It's a bad word. It was stupid to ever encourage it. There are better words to use to look at review and civilian review oversight of police forces. At the end of the day, it is a very, very powerful ad because the two most important aspects of human life are one's own safety, mortality, and the other one is your health. And that one actually hits both of those points.
And again, you said earlier in the show that you think that the strategy of Joe Biden of sitting back and letting Donald Trump be his own worst enemy works only up to a point.
I believe that to be the case. Right now it's working. If you believe polls, I don't believe polls. Polls are not voters. Polls are not votes. On the other hand, I know that in looking at Senate races around the country, as far north as Alaska and as far south as even in Georgia, Republicans are very, very worried. The chances of the Democrats taking back the US Senate are very high right now. And actually, at the end of the day, no matter whether Biden wins or loses, the Democrats have to own the Senate. Obviously, if Biden wins, because that's the Supreme Court, and if Biden loses, that's our Supreme Court. So we're talking about a multiple number of very, very challenging scenarios going into this election. But again, I revert back to the fact that Donald Trump has all of the cards, so to speak. And in fact, to Mr. Beatty's point about corporate America is funding Donald Trump to a large extent for various favors. So not all corporate America is trying to be part of this conspiracy that Mr. Beatty is presenting to us. But at the end of the day, ultimately corporate America often hides behind, quote, we're protecting our shareholders. That's why we have to go along with this policy or that policy coming out of the White House.
Darren Beatty, why is it that on Tuesday, the U.S. president, for the very first time in that press conference, emphatically insisting people wear the mask, seen in public only in the last few days for the first time wearing the mask? How do you explain that?
It's hard to explain. I've been a bit disappointed by the mixed messaging coming out of the White House in relation to the whole coronavirus issue, and really on a lot of issues. I think they have a good chance going into 2020, but they really need to take message discipline seriously. And I think the mask issue was actually a bit off message and counterproductive, and a product of a lot of different people providing advice of ranging in quality. And this might have been low quality advice. And I think it's just kind of confusing and not terribly productive.
The world over, the COVID-19 pandemic, a test of leadership, and one that's really putting world leaders in the spotlight. In the United States, though, it's coming in the midst of what some have dubbed a culture war. We've talked about the race issues. We've talked about some of the other ones. If you look at Donald Trump's Twitter feed over the past 24 hours, he has once again taken aim at one of his favorite topics, which is mail-in voting. Mail-in voting, unless changed by the courts, will lead to the most corrupt election, capital letters, in our nation's history. Hashtag rigged election, Bernard Harcourt.
Right. Well, I think you're entirely right to frame this through the question of culture wars, and you can see it well, of course, in that that ad that you just showed us, the Trump ad, which was probably one of the most despicable ads I've ever seen in my life. But it ties precisely to this question of converting everything into a culture war, of course, and drawing everything into this kind of white and black, which is metaphorical, but also racial, into a white and black situation. And I think that what's interesting, what was particularly interesting about that television ad, and of course the culture wars, whether it's about the mail-in ballots and others, is that it does try to create this clear distinction that I think that was actually reflected or mirrored in Darren's comment about the protest movement, and so because if you listen closely to what Darren was saying, he was basically trying to paint the entire protest movement or the entire resistance movement as Antifa, right? As being extreme, violent movement against in the United States, and I think that that of course is what Trump is trying to achieve through these culture wars, but I think that that's of course what needs to be pointed out, marked out, and clearly shown to be wrong, because I mean these are predominantly peaceful protests across the country. It's a wave of protest, a wave of political movement that we haven't seen in a long time in this country. Predominantly peaceful throughout cities across the country, with of course some confrontations and some ultimately.
And we've had a sidebar issue to all of that, Bernard, which is that there has been an upsurge in violence in inner cities. The latest example being a drive-by shooting at a funeral parlor in Chicago late on Tuesday. Why have we seen, at the same time as all of this is happening, this resurgence in crime?
All right. Well, you have to understand crime patterns are difficult to analyze. They tend to go up in the summertime. We're in a historically unprecedented time where people have been confined for about 3 months. Most people in this country are going through some form of psychological trauma as a result of COVID and the pandemic that has completely uplifted their lives. Unemployment rates are have skyrocketed. I mean, you have to understand we're in a unique historical period that is causing extraordinary trauma to most Americans. It wouldn't be surprising in the least that some of that might be, and again, we need to parse the statistics very closely. It is summertime rates go up. So we need to parse this very closely. But, you know, these mild variations in crime statistics that we've seen are not really indicative, but would probably reflect something about the psychological trauma that this country is experiencing. We've seen
we're running short on time. It's one of our last shows before our summer break, and so we know that the convention in the United States is due at the end of August. Yet I'm going to go ask the panel to be quick about it. Joe Biden, should he announce his running mate? Because that's the next big question in the United States. I'll begin, of course, with you, Peter Emerson. And who would you like to see as his running mate?
He will announce his running mate, obviously.
Soon?
And I think very soon. That's the reports I get from my friends in the campaign. But
like how
it changes day to day. In terms of who I would like to see, I want to see a candidate that he chooses who the American people will accept as the next president of the United States. Usually, a vice presidential candidate is chosen for electoral positioning, for added political value. In this case, historically, as we've all been talking about in historic time, it has to be someone that the American people can envision and recognize as the next president of the United States, because the odds are very good they will be.
Darren Beatty, if you could whisper into the ear of the opposition, who would you say?
I entirely agree with your previous panelists that Biden needs to pick someone that the American people can accept as the next president. And for that reason, I would strongly advise Stacey Abrams.
And Baghamari?
Crystal balls get very clouded, especially when it comes to presidential elections. The best reporting I've seen on it has indicated that Biden is looking for someone who will be to him what he was to Barack Obama, that there's almost a mind meld, that there's a personality meld, someone who is going to be a true partner in the White House. So I have no idea who that is for him, but I do think he will announce before the convention. I think he'll want the convention to be a coronation of sorts for that person.
Bernard Harcourt, do you have a crystal ball?
Well, I think that there are such an extraordinary number of extraordinary women who could serve as vice president to President Biden that it's hard to name any particular one. Stacey Abrams, Tammy Duckworth. I think we have an extraordinary choice here, and I'm confident that it will be someone that we will all be inspired by.
All right, we shall see. Lots going to happen between now and those conventions in August. I want to thank you so much, Bernard Harcourt. I want to thank Darren Beatty in Boca Raton, Peter Emerson in New York, and Baghamari in Italy. We want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. There's much more on our website, france24.com, as well as Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel. Bye for now.